White cops tied a black woman to a pole for fun, not knowing she is their new chief. Before we get into this story, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments, and if you believe that all people deserve to be treated with respect and regard, no matter the color of their skin, subscribe to this channel to show your support and spread awareness. Now let's get into it. This story begins in a police precinct in New York. The precinct bustled with activity as officers filed reports, answered calls, and moved in and out of the building. Margaret Daniels sat at her desk reviewing paperwork, her coffee cup steaming beside her. The sound of footsteps approaching made her look up. Captain Monroe, her supervisor, stood in front of her with a wide grin. "Margaret," he said, "can I see you in my office for a minute?" Margaret furrowed her brow but stood, following him into the glass-walled office overlooking the busy precinct floor. Once inside, Monroe closed the door and gestured for her to sit. "Margaret," he began, his voice filled with pride, "you've been one of the best officers I've ever worked with. Your leadership and dedication are unmatched, and it's time you take the next step in your career." She tilted her head, curious but cautious. "What are you saying, Captain?" Monroe leaned forward, sliding a formal letter across the desk. "You've been promoted to Chief of Police. Congratulations." Margaret's eyes widened as she read the letter. "Chief, are you serious?" Monroe chuckled. "Dead serious. You've earned this, Margaret. But there's a catch. It's in Northridge City, and the transfer is effective immediately. You'll need to start tomorrow." Margaret's heart swelled with pride, but the suddenness of the news left her scrambling for words. "I thank you. This is incredible, but tomorrow? That doesn't leave me much time." "Think of it as a challenge," Monroe said with a grin. "You've always thrived under pressure." Word of her promotion spread quickly, and soon the precinct was buzzing with congratulations. Colleagues gathered around, clapping her on the back and offering kind words. "You deserve this, Margaret," one officer said. "They're lucky to have you." "Thank you," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. Later that evening, Margaret packed her belongings into her old sedan. She tried to book a flight to Northridge City, but every seat was sold out. Sighing, she decided to drive the 8-hour journey instead. As she pulled out of the precinct parking lot, the city lights faded in her rearview mirror. Excitement mixed with nerves as she embarked on the next chapter of her career, unaware of the trials that lay ahead. As her road trip began, the highway stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by dense forests on one side and open fields on the other. Margaret Daniels hummed along to the jazz playlist she'd queued up, her fingers tapping the steering wheel in time with the music. Her old sedan cruised steadily down the quiet road, the hum of the engine blending with the soothing melodies. She glanced at the dashboard clock. It was just past 5 p.m., and the sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. A faint smile played on her lips as she thought about her new role. Chief of Police. It felt surreal, and while excitement buzzed in her chest, there was an undercurrent of nervousness too. "New city, new challenges," she murmured to herself. "I've got this." Margaret's thoughts shifted to the team she'd soon be leading. She hoped to make a positive impact, to build trust and fairness in the community. But before she could get too lost in her reflections, a sputtering noise jolted her from her thoughts. "What the?" she muttered, glancing at the dashboard. The check engine light blinked angrily, and the car began to slow down. "No, no, no, not now!" she exclaimed, pulling over to the side of the road. The sedan shuddered and came to a complete stop. Margaret groaned, leaning back in her seat. She grabbed her phone from the passenger seat, but her heart sank when she saw the screen. No bars, no signal. "Of course," she muttered, stepping out of the car. The chilly evening air bit at her skin as she held her phone up, waving it around in the hopes of catching a signal. The road was deserted, and the distant chirping of crickets only added to her growing frustration. After several minutes of walking up and down the roadside, her phone finally showed a single bar. She quickly dialed 911, her breath visible in the cool air as she waited for the call to connect. 911, what's your emergency? A voice answered. Hi, Margaret said, trying to keep calm. I'm stranded on Highway 22, about 10 miles south of Northridge City. My car broke down, and I don't have reception out here. Stay where you are, the operator replied. We'll send someone to assist you. Relieved but anxious, Margaret returned to her car, unaware of the ordeal awaiting her. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting an amber glow over the empty highway, Margaret stood by her car, her arms crossed against the growing chill. She tried to steady her nerves, hopeful that help was on its way. The faint hum of an engine reached her ears. She turned and saw a patrol car approaching, its lights flashing faintly in the fading light. Relief flooded her chest, but it was short-lived. The cruiser came to a stop a few feet away, and 3 white officers stepped out, their boots crunching against the gravel. They exchanged looks before approaching Margaret with smirks that instantly made her stomach tighten. Is this the emergency? One of them, a tall man with a buzz cut, sneered. Well, would you look at this? We've got a real-life monkey on the loose. Margaret stiffened, her jaw tightening. My car broke down, she said calmly, trying to maintain her composure. I called 911 for assistance. The second officer, shorter and stockier, snorted. Bet she broke the car by sitting on it. Look at her, fat and useless. The third officer, younger and seemingly uncomfortable, avoided her gaze but didn't say anything to stop the others. Margaret inhaled deeply, keeping her voice steady. I'm stranded and I need help, that's all. If you can't assist me, I'll wait for a tow truck. But the tall officer stepped closer, his smirk widening. Stranded? Lady, you're lucky we even showed up. Out here, no one's gonna help someone like you. Someone like me? Margaret asked, her voice still firm despite the growing anger in her chest. Yeah, you heard me, the shorter one said, leaning against their cruiser. Fat, ugly, and stupid. What are you even doing out here? This ain't your kind of town. Margaret clenched her fists, but she kept her tone professional. I don't want trouble. I just need to get to the city. Her words only made them laugh harder. Oh, we'll help you, all right? The tall officer said mockingly. The tone of their laughter echoed in her ears, the sharp sting of humiliation cutting deep. She stayed silent, realizing this was no ordinary encounter, and that help wasn't what they had come to offer. The sun had set, and the air grew colder as darkness settled over the deserted highway. Margaret stood stiffly by her car, her breaths visible in the night air. The officers, now fully engrossed in their twisted game, exchanged amused glances. Well, the tall officer said with a mocking grin, since you called us for help, let's make sure you stay safe. Before Margaret could respond, the shorter officer grabbed her arm roughly. What are you doing? Let me go, she protested, her voice shaking with anger and fear. Relax, lady, the tall one said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. We're just making sure you don't wander off and hurt yourself. Margaret tried to resist, but the two officers were stronger. They dragged her to a nearby utility pole at the edge of the road. The younger officer hesitated, looking uneasy. Guys, maybe we shouldn't. Shut up, the taller one snapped. Don't go soft on us now. They shoved Margaret against the pole and used heavy-duty ropes to bind her wrists behind her back. Her body trembled as they tightened the ties, cutting into her skin. Please, Margaret said, her voice cracking. This isn't right. Just let me go. Her words were met with laughter. The shorter officer pulled out his phone and snapped a picture. Gotta document this for the boys back at the station, he said with a smirk. Let's see if she can call her jungle friends to save her, the tall one joked, earning more laughter from his partner. Humiliated and helpless, Margaret's tears spilled over. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice breaking. Why not? The shorter officer replied. Who's going to care about you? Satisfied with their handiwork, the officers climbed back into their cruiser. Have fun out here, the tall one called out, his laughter ringing out as the car doors slammed shut. Margaret's heart sank as the cruiser pulled away, its red and blue lights disappearing into the distance. Alone on the side of the road, tied to a pole with no way to call for help, she felt the cold creeping into her bones and the weight of her humiliation bearing down on her. If you have sympathy for what Margaret has had to face, and you completely detest dirty cops and racially biased people, show your support for her by hitting the subscribe button. But even in her darkest moment, a small spark of resilience flickered inside her. This wasn't the end. Not yet. And as God would have it, the hum of an approaching truck broke the stillness as Joe, a middle-aged truck driver with a kind face and weathered hands, drove down the empty highway. His headlights illuminated the dark road ahead, but as he rounded a bend, something caught his eye. Slowing down, Joe squinted. "What in the world?" he muttered, seeing a figure tied to a pole on the roadside. Without hesitation, he pulled over, his brakes hissing as the truck came to a stop. Grabbing a flashlight from his glove compartment, Joe stepped out and approached cautiously. "Ma'am," he called out, shining the beam toward the figure. His heart sank when he saw Margaret, her head hanging low, her body trembling against the cold. "Are you okay?" he asked, rushing forward. Margaret lifted her head weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, help me." Joe didn't need to hear more. He pulled a pocket knife from his jacket and carefully cut the rope binding her wrists. Margaret slumped forward, and he caught her gently, steadying her. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Margaret shook her head, her lips trembling. "3 cops. They tied me here and left me." Her voice cracked and tears filled her eyes. Joe's jaw tightened as anger flashed across his face. "I don't know who those cowards are," he said firmly, "but they'll get what's coming to them. You didn't deserve this." He led Margaret to his truck, helping her climb into the passenger seat. From the back, he grabbed a warm blanket and a bottle of water, handing them to her. "Here," he said gently, "drink this. You're safe now." Margaret sipped the water, her hands shaking. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Joe started the engine, glancing at her with a reassuring smile. "I'll get you into the city. No way I'm leaving you out here like this." As the truck rumbled down the highway, Margaret sat quietly, her exhaustion giving way to a growing resolve. Those officers wouldn't get away with what they did. She tightened the blanket around herself and stared out at the passing lights, quietly planning her next move. I hope you have subscribed to my channel. Thank you for your support so far. You are amazing. Like, share, and hit the subscribe button right away. The night was short, and the next morning, the precinct buzzed with the usual morning activity. Officers gathered around desks, sipping coffee, and exchanging casual banter. In one corner, 3 officers, John, Mike, and Rick, leaned against a desk, laughing loudly as they recounted the events of the previous night. "You should have seen her face when we left her there," Mike chuckled, shaking his head. "She was crying like a baby. Bet she's still tied to that pole." Rick snorted. "Serves her right. Fat, loud, and useless. She didn't belong out there anyway." John, the youngest, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, the laughter of his partners drowning out his unease. The sound of clicking heels interrupted their conversation. The precinct's main doors swung open, and the room seemed to hush as Margaret Daniels entered. She was dressed sharply in her new chief of police uniform, the gold badge gleaming on her chest. Her posture was confident, her head held high as her eyes scanned the room. The staff turned to look at her, some whispering to each other. No one had been told who the new chief was, and her presence commanded immediate attention. Margaret walked straight past the desks, her face calm, but her eyes sharp, every step deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath. The 3 officers' laughter faded as they noticed the change in the room's atmosphere. John looked up first, and his jaw dropped. "No way," he muttered, his face turning pale. Mike and Rick followed his gaze, and their smug expressions quickly vanished. Margaret stopped in front of them, her piercing gaze locking onto each of them in turn. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice steady but firm. I'm Margaret Daniels, your new chief of police." The three officers stood frozen, their faces draining of color. Rick opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Margaret tilted her head slightly, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Something wrong?" she asked, her tone calm but cutting. The rest of the room watched in stunned silence as Margaret's words hung in the air. The three officers looked like they wanted to disappear, their humiliation palpable. Margaret straightened her shoulders. This was just the beginning. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the room, but she continued, unshaken. "It's an honor to lead this department. I expect professionalism, integrity, and fairness from every one of you. There is no room here for misconduct, bigotry, or abuse of power. None." Margaret's tone hardened slightly as her eyes swept across the room. When she reached the back corner, she locked eyes with John, Mike, and Rick. Their faces turned pale, their postures stiffening. She took a step forward. "Last night, 3 officers from this department responded to a stranded motorist. Instead of assisting her, they chose to insult, degrade, and humiliate her. They tied her to a pole and left her there." Gasps echoed through the room. Officers glanced at one another in disbelief, the tension thick. Margaret's gaze didn't waver as she stared directly at the 3 men. "I was that motorist." John stammered, his voice weak. "Chief, we didn't." Mike tried to jump in, his tone defensive. "It wasn't like that, we—" Margaret raised a hand, silencing them. Her calm, steady demeanor carried more weight than any shouting could. "You didn't see a woman in need last night," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "You saw someone you thought you could demean and leave to suffer, but you didn't know who you were dealing with. Now you do." The 3 officers shrank under her gaze, their attempts at excuses dying on their lips. Margaret turned to the rest of the department. "Effective immediately, Officers John Larson, Mike Hayes, and Rick Daniels are terminated from this department. This kind of behavior has no place here." The room erupted into murmurs, some officers nodding in approval, while others whispered in shock. Margaret stood firm, her expression unyielding. "Let this serve as a reminder to everyone. The badge you wear is a symbol of service and respect. If you can't uphold that, you don't belong here." As she walked out of the room, the 3 disgraced officers sat frozen in their seats, their humiliation complete. Margaret had made her message clear. This department would be different under her leadership. Margaret sat in her new office, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow through the windows. The space was neatly organized, with her nameplate already resting on the desk, Chief Margaret Daniels. She stared out at the city below, deep in thought, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her desk. The events of the past 24 hours played over and over in her mind, the cruelty she endured on the roadside, the humiliation, and the fear. It wasn't just what had happened to her, it was what it represented. How many others had suffered similar injustices, ignored or mistreated simply because of their appearance? She sighed, leaning back in her chair. People were too quick to judge, too quick to label others based on their skin color, weight, or background. She knew the danger of such unchecked prejudice. It didn't just harm individuals, it eroded trust in the very institutions meant to protect and serve. Her gaze fell on the photo of her late father on her desk. He had been a community leader, someone who believed in fairness and equality. His lessons echoed in her mind now. If you want to see change, you have to be the one to start it. Margaret pulled out a blank notepad and clicked her pen as she began jotting down ideas. Initiatives to root out bias. Mandatory diversity and sensitivity training. Every officer in the department would undergo training to address prejudice, unconscious bias, and the importance of treating every citizen with respect. Community engagement programs. Officers would participate in regular town hall meetings, volunteer projects, and school visits to rebuild trust with the community. Anonymous reporting system, a safe platform for both citizens and officers to report misconduct or discrimination without fear of retaliation. Revised recruitment standards, ensuring that new hires reflected the values of integrity and fairness, with thorough background checks and character assessments. As Margaret wrote, a sense of purpose steadied her. This wasn't just about punishing those 3 officers. It was about ensuring the culture of the department changed for the better. She placed the pen down and glanced out the window again, determination glinting in her eyes. This was her chance to make a real difference, not just as a chief, but as a leader who demanded justice and fairness for all. This story isn't just about Margaret Daniels and her triumph over injustice. It's a reminder of the power of respect and kindness. It shows how dangerous unchecked prejudice can be and how deeply it can harm individuals and communities. Bigotry, discrimination, and abuse of power have no place in our society. Everyone, no matter their skin color, background, or appearance, deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness. But the responsibility to create a better world doesn't rest on leaders alone. It starts with all of us. What would you do if you witnessed someone being treated unfairly? Would you stand by or would you stand up? Would you ignore it or would you speak out? If you enjoyed this story, let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next story when it drops. Justice isn't a moment, it's a movement. The end.